Thank you all so much again for joining us for today's discussion on encryption and exceptional access. For those that I don't know, my name is Allison Peters. I'm the Deputy Director of the National Security Program at the think tank Third Way, where I also help to run what we call the Cyber Enforcement Initiative, which is focused on strengthening government's abilities to identify, stop, and bring to justice malicious cyber actors. I think today's discussion, the topic will be familiar to some on this call, but might be quite new to others. So in terms of a background framing, the Department of Justice for many years has made a push in response to both the proliferation of cybercrime as well as in response to other forms of crime and national security threats, including terrorism, that law enforcement needs what's often referred to as exceptional access to encryption devices. DOJ has made a case, including to many on this call that are from the US Congress. Without this access, their efforts to investigate a wide spectrum of crimes will be severely hindered by encryption, a problem often referred to as going dark. I think many on the call, particularly from Capitol Hill, might be more familiar with the arguments in terms of why encryption is important to protecting Americans' privacy. But what we want to explore on this discussion today is another side of the coin, which is why encryption is critical for US national security and why exceptional access poses a threat to American national security. And we'll also discuss ways that Congress can support law enforcement in its efforts to investigate these crimes that does not undermine encryption and pose a threat to US national security. We're incredibly lucky to be joined by a distinguished lineup of speakers today on this very issue. We have Michael Daniel, the former White House Cybersecurity Coordinator for President Obama and the President and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We have Mieke Eoyang, the Senior Vice President for the National Security Person at Third Way, former professional staff member of the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, who also held a very wide spectrum of roles on Capitol Hill that she can tell you about. And then we have Matt Olsen, the former director of the National Counterterrorism Center and general counsel for the NSA, who also had a really long and decorated career at DOJ and now holds many, many different hats. Two housekeeping points before we get started. One, this conversation will be on the record. And two, you can send questions and thoughts in the chat box throughout. So while we'll wrap up a bit early to make sure we leave time for questions, I'd encourage you to send them throughout the conversation. So kicking us off, I want to turn to you, Michael. Oftentimes we use a lot of terms in the encryption policy debates that for those that are not particularly in the weeds on this issue might be a bit confusing. So I'm hoping you might be able to talk through for the audience, one, what do we mean when we talk about encryption? What does encryption mean? And two, oftentimes we hear these terms data in motion and data at rest. And we hear, particularly folks on Capitol Hill, that those terms can be quite confusing. So it'd be helpful for you to dig in a bit in terms of what we mean by those. I'll turn it over to you, Michael.
Thanks, Allison, and thanks for inviting me to participate in this conversation. Encryption is really actually when we talk about it, it's really a more sophisticated, more digitized version of some of the games you might have played as a kid, of like transforming words, transposing the letters in words to other letters according to some pattern that you're given. Really, encryption is just using mathematical formulas to transform data, to transform the ones and zeros of digital information into a form that is unreadable unless you have that key. So unless you have the key to the formula that was used to transform that data, you can't read it, you can't understand it, you can't do things with it. That's really all it is. Now the math that goes into doing those transformations is extraordinarily complex. And is really actually only understood by a handful of people, but the result is actually fairly straightforward. Now, when we talk about data in motion versus data at rest, what that is talking about is how what state the data is in. So if it's at rest, it means it's being stored. And that can be stored anywhere from a hard drive on your laptop to your mobile device to something in the cloud. but it means that it's being stored and it's not being used for any purpose at that time. Data in motion refers to data that is actually being either transmitted, so from one device to another, or it's actually being used, data in use. So in other words, think about when you've called up something from a database into the temporary storage on a computer to actually do something with it. So the data is actually, in some sense, it's moving. The ones and zeros are in motion. That's why we use those terms. So really it's about whether the data is sitting someplace on a storage device of some type versus actually being used or being transmitted between devices.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. I think oftentimes we kick off these conversations and we just launch into using a bunch of terms, and it can often be quite confusing, particularly for policy staff that are handling a pretty broad spectrum of issues. One of the things, Mieke, turning over to you, Third Way recently put out a brief on this very issue. And one of the things that was discussed in this brief is about the benefits to US national security of encryption. So oftentimes in the policy debates, we talk about privacy and the need for encryption to protect Americans' privacy, but I'm hoping you can share a bit for those on the call in terms of the benefits of encryption to American national security.
Yeah, so, US national security often depends on keeping certain kinds of information sensitive information away from adversaries who might exploit it to do us harm. And so often what we see is that lots of different kinds of information we want to protect from our adversaries. So things like operational plans, even personal information about people who work in national security, their home addresses, their medical records, things that might be transmitted over commercial networks and not necessarily clearly classified information. So the national security establishment uses encryption, as Michael described it, to protect their information, whether that's classified information or other things, from prying eyes. And we've seen in the US, and not just in the US, but in some of our allied countries, a real push to encourage people to use encrypted services to protect their information. For example, the Department of Defense is very nervous about its employees using programs like this one, Zoom, because Zoom did not provide the kind of end-to-end encryption that they would want for DoD employees even to have unclassified conversations. So we see in the national security space a heavy reliance on encrypted, protected technologies just to do their daily business, not even for those things that the government considers secret, which we also want to protect at even higher levels. But it's really important. And government employees are, like the rest of us, relying on all kinds of internet services to stay in touch with their families, to send their kids to school, to communicate about travel plans, well, not so much travel plans anymore, but in the past, travel plans, and just normal communications. So it's really important that they, like the rest of us, have those protections for what they do.
So Matt, you spent a really long career in the US national security community, including at DOJ. And as Mieke is walking through, we know that there's two pieces of this in terms of the benefit of encryption, both to our country's national security and to privacy. But there is an argument from the Department of Justice and law enforcement that has a pretty long timeline in terms of really the impact of encryption on their ability to investigate a wide range of crimes and national security threats, and really a push for what we call exceptional access. And we're seeing that pick up under this Department of Justice with Capitol Hill right now and the consideration of a number of pieces of legislation. So, given your long career in law enforcement, I think it would be helpful for those on the call to really understand the history here, the historical context of the arguments that DOJ has made on exceptional access. Are their concerns legitimate? I mean, is there something that really is a big concern about encryption when it comes to the investigation of crime?
Yeah, well, thank you, Allison, and thanks to you and Third Way for including me in this discussion. It's great to be here. Look, I think it is important to put this discussion and conversation in some historical context. It's certainly not a new issue. Encryption is not a new challenge for law enforcement. You can go back to the mid-1990s and the so-called Clipper chip controversy. That was an effort to create a so-called master key that the government would have, or potentially a third party would have, that would be used to break encryption. And security experts at the time pointed out the inherent risks with that approach, and particularly the catastrophic consequences if that key, that master key, were stolen. And that was a bruising battle from 25 years ago. And since that time, you know, the issue's only gotten harder in a way because encryption's become even more fundamentally important to the operation of the internet and to the security of our communications. I mean, it's just not possible to operate in a global communication system without encryption. As Mieke pointed out, we all depend on encryption, and it's vitally important to our national security. And in some ways, the United States is more vulnerable to weaknesses in our communications precisely because of our reliance on digital networks. And look, DOJ's recognized this. All of their statements, they always say they support the development of strong encryption. It's key to commerce and trade and privacy, as well as cybersecurity. But the problem, to get to your question, is that encryption is also equally available and increasingly available to malicious actors, whether we're talking about terrorists or criminals. And there's really, I think it's important to say, there's no doubt that evidence that's critical to solving crimes, homicides, kidnappings, child exploitation, and preventing terrorist attacks, it's on our phones, it's on computers, it's on online communications. And when that information is not available to law enforcement, when law enforcement may have a warrant, a legal right to get to that data or that information, we are not going to be able to solve, in some cases, crimes. And there is a cost to pay for that. And so I think, to answer your question directly, I do think there's a legitimate concern from a law enforcement perspective about the use of encryption and how that can undermine the mission to protect public safety. So, you know, I think the debate over encryption often doesn't really fully account for these legitimate concerns of encryption. I was a prosecutor, you know, for 12 years before I got involved in national security. So I think, you know, the real question is, how do you then strike the right balance? And how do you look at this so it's not just a one side versus the other side, zero-sum discussion? And how do you get away from absolutist positions that you sometimes see in this debate to recognize both sides, that it's really not privacy versus security, it's sort of security versus security. How do you weigh the security concerns on both sides of this debate? And by, I think, sort of getting away from those absolutist positions, we're better positioned as a, you know, as a community here to move forward with potential solutions.
Yeah, and you know, Mieke, one of the things that Third Way talks about in their brief, you know, to Matt's point of this is really a cost-benefit analysis, and you need to weigh security versus security. So Matt just brought up, you know, the legitimate concerns of law enforcement in the investigation of a wide range of crimes that I think all of us on this call, everyone in the US Congress cares deeply about combating. And so the question is, on the one side, we have these legitimate concerns, but as you point out in the brief, there's also real concerns about the provision of exceptional access, not only what that would do in terms of benefiting American adversaries, both state and non-state actors, but also how that might disadvantage American companies, particularly at a time where we're in a pandemic and our economy has already taken such a big hit. I think weighing those legitimate concerns that Matt just shared, I'm wondering if you can dive a bit deeper in terms of the arguments that you laid out in this new report on the other side of that argument.
Yeah, and like, look, we agree with Matt. There are serious concerns that law enforcement has with the growth of encryption, but not only that, the ways in which crime has moved onto the internet. And we think there are lots of different ways that law enforcement can think about solving that problem and making their situation better, that don't involve going after this very fundamental protection that exists for the internet. And, you know, Matt has done a really long report, or really sort of foundational report on this, the Don't Panic report produced at Harvard that he was involved with. It talks about the growth of metadata. We've seen in cases where DOJ has complained about access to encrypted data that they've actually been able to find ways around that. I think it's really important to talk about, for DOJ to be very specific about the how. What exactly is their problem? How do they break it down into component pieces? Because encryption covers a wide range of devices and applications and functions that it protects. And like, where exactly are we talking about it? Are we talking about, as Michael said, the data in motion problem, which is very hard to solve? or the data at rest piece with a device in custody where the Department of Justice may be able to hire someone to do forensic analysis of that device and figure out how to recover information from it because it's lawfully theirs and they can get a warrant to like sort of look at that. Now they may not be able to compel a manufacturer to solve it for them, but they may be able to build out their forensic capability. We have a lot of very skilled engineers in the US government who have expertise in doing this. And there are lots of people around the world who would be interested in helping DOJ, as we've seen before, break into that information, break in and get them that information. But the challenge that you pose about foreign US companies and sort of what that means for reciprocity and what that means internationally, it's very clear that all of us are reliant on the most secure technologies that we can find to communicate with our loved ones, to communicate about all kinds of things. And if the US says, look, we need to be able to get access to that information and the companies have to be able to give us that information and they have to have that administrative access, then what we're saying to US companies is that, and to the American public, every communication that you have is only as secure as the company's system for accessing that information. And people may remember a few weeks ago when Twitter had to lock down all of its verified accounts because someone had gotten access through their administrative panel to the verified accounts and all the direct messages of those people. What that means is if the company itself retains that access to be able to see the content, someone can break into that. If the government insists that US companies provide that kind of access through the company to that content, then what you'll see is other countries where the US laws don't apply, and they could be allied countries, countries like Canada, French companies, Swiss companies, saying, okay, the US doesn't provide that information, you know, the major US technology companies won't provide that anymore, we'll offer that. And you could see the growth of technology industries in other countries where encryption is still legal to offer in ways that it could really damage the US technology industry writ large. And US laws won't be able to do that. And we could lose our technology leadership fairly quickly if we say the US government will not allow companies based in the United States to offer those services. You could also see US companies moving offshore as a result of that to still be able to offer this important protection to their customers and users. And so from that perspective, we're talking not just about national security and the security of information in the national security establishment, but the US national security as it goes to like the strength of our economy. Because the technology industry is one of the few industries that's still able to produce in this pandemic, and it is one of the most growing and vibrant parts of the US economy generally. So it's really, we put at risk America's economic national security edge if we start talking about forcing American companies to give up this vital protection.
Yeah, and you know, both for Michael and Matt, I'm interested in your perspective on that. We have sort of the argument that exceptional access will disadvantage American companies and also benefit America's adversaries. But there's another piece here in the foreign policy space, which is the potential impact and thinking of foreign governments and how they might move forward with exceptional access. We saw Australia already pass a piece of legislation on this. We know the UK is moving forward, India, there's a number of proposals out there. And so I think the question for you both, particularly since you've served in government and have worked with foreign partners, what do you think the ramifications would be internationally if exceptional access is provided in the United States? Really, how do you expect other countries to react? And I'll dovetail on that too, you know, what impact do you think this would have on the State Department and our diplomats who are going around the globe and pushing governments to make sure that they're securing their communications and technology? At the same time, we ourselves are seeing the Department of Justice go up to Capitol Hill and make the argument for exceptional access. And so I think there's a question there about how that impacts the advocacy that we're doing around the globe on this issue. But would love to hear from both of you, given your past experience, really what you think would be the ramifications internationally if exceptional access were to be provided by Congress.
Well, Matt, I mean, I think from my perspective, one of the strongest arguments that our vendors have right now, that American companies have right now, is that they can't do it, right? They don't have the technology in place to provide that access. And so a lot of the other countries can say that they want it, but it's hard for them to, you know, demand that in a way that the companies have to respond. But if the U.S. government demands it of the vendors and then they have to comply because they're a U.S.-based company, then that argument no longer holds. And so if they provide it for the U.S., they have to provide it for everybody else on the planet. We are not special. And that is just one of the things that I know we like to think that we're the good guys and wear the white hats, and the rest of the planet just doesn't see it that way. And that is the reality that we have to live in. And so if it, you know, you can use whatever metaphor, goose, gander, whatever, but if it's, you know, if the US government has it, then everybody else will argue that they should be able to have it. And there's no longer a leg for our companies to stand on to say that they don't have the engineering or technical capacity to do it, or it's not part of their business model. And so that then leads you into several other ramifications, which is that, you know, we have due process, right? But other countries do not. And then you can imagine all sorts of scenarios where how does a company respond to, you know, an investigator coming to them from another country that says, we believe this American has committed a crime against one of our citizens. Please give us access to all their communications. Even though that American is located in the United States. They've committed a crime, that's our, you know, we've alleged that, give us the information. You know, how does the company respond to that? Like, they know, the government knows that they can provide that access. So, you know, what are they gonna say? Like, show us your piece of paper? You know, it puts the American company in a completely untenable position. And so we open the door to surveillance by, you know, by a foreign government. So there are all sorts of ramifications that we have to think about, several moves down the chessboard, if we're actually, you know, when you're actually considering the policy implications here.
Yeah, and you know, I think, Michael, that's a very good example because it's not a hypothetical scenario. It's something that I think we hear across the board from the tech community that they're challenged with, particularly with data localization moves. And as governments are really continuing to push on tech companies and others to provide certain data to them, it really puts American businesses in a really hard place in terms of wanting to respect due process, but operating in countries that don't themselves respect due process. I'm wondering, you know, turning to you, particularly having worked on counterterrorism cases for so long, if you can sort of piggyback off of Michael, really sort of how do you see this playing out if Congress moves forward with any sort of legislation on exceptional access? What do you think the impact would be internationally?
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with what Michael said, and you know, you talk, you know, the metaphor of the, you know, opening the door, and in some ways the problem is open, or the door is open on the problem, which is that, you know, global companies, multinational companies based in the United States are facing this problem now with data requests, right, from governments where they're operating all over the world. Many of them, you know, autocratic, or at least not as, you know, not as willing to apply due process principles that we're used to in the United States. So with regard to all types of data. But the challenge that sort of posed in this particular scenario is if there were an instance where US companies were required to change the architecture of their services in some ways to, you know, to allow for access, that would just take away one more significant argument that companies, US-based companies, have globally when it comes to the types of requests that we would be, you know, I think we can agree we would not be comfortable with when foreign governments, really including autocratic regimes, look to crack down, for example, on political dissidents and journalists who might be using encrypted platforms to protect their communications, right? And so, again, this is a broad challenge for companies because a lot of data is not encrypted, but this slice of the challenge is particularly acute when it comes to the idea that if the US were to mandate access, it would eliminate, you know, an important argument that companies have in refusing to provide access to information in countries where we operate, where those companies operate operate globally. So that's a partial answer. I think the more broad answer, Allison, to your question goes back to Mieke's answer. I mean, it's a tough challenge in a way, because from a counterterrorism perspective, we saw that terrorists use encrypted communication platforms to communicate their plans and operations. We've seen that happen, and there are actual examples of that where that information was not available to U.S. Counterterrorism operators. But by the same token, encryption is critical to the ability of U.S. counterterrorism, the counterterrorism community, to operate effectively. That includes the military, the State Department, intelligence. So it's not, look, this is a really hard problem, and that example, that counterterrorism example, I think well illustrates both sides of it.
Yeah, and piggybacking off of that, Mieke, one of the points I think you make in the brief is that there is this question of, okay, so exceptional access is provided, then what? Will those terrorist organizations and lone wolf actors just move to another encrypted platform that is not created by an American company? And so we've seen this in CT cases around the globe. They are quite innovative, and they do shift their operations and thinking. And so drawing out from Matt's example, because I think it's a real one, we saw in the Pensacola case in the 2019 shooting at a naval base, the Department of Justice, Attorney General Barr, came out and said they had found that shooter was connected to an Al-Qaeda affiliate, and encryption did pose a problem to the investigation. So drawing on Matt's example, and Michael, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, do you feel like this is actually an issue in counterterrorism cases that would be solved by exceptional access, or would we just see a shifting in terms of platforms?
I mean, I certainly see a shifting. And one of the challenges, right, like this is the problem. If American law enforcement is guaranteed access to US platforms, what you'll get are some like dumb criminals and terrorists continuing to use those things, like people who don't patch, right? They still remain vulnerable to all kinds of exploits that bad guys or others might use to like get access to their communications. But we're already seeing some of the more sophisticated actors, nation states and others, developing their own platforms for covert communications. And that will remain the case. And so I think it's important for crimes, for those that like the FBI, Department of Justice, or even your local law enforcement is trying to solve, that are stymied by technology. In many of those cases we've seen, or not in many, in some of those cases, we've seen that with enough attention and technological expertise, they are able to make those cases. And the question really is, how much of this is really about the encryption being the problem, or it's that they don't know how to interpret the other information that is out there to be able to build the case. There's a rich trove of metadata and location data that they can use to track, which is not encrypted, that's based on the device. There may be human sources that they can use. There may be other things where other applications or email addresses, that digital clues and fingerprints that criminals leave that can be used to trace this. We don't really have a good sense from law enforcement on exactly where the holdup is. And given how pervasive encryption is across a wide range of services, breaking this problem down into bite-sized chunks so that we know, are you talking about a cell phone that you seized at the scene of the crime, or are you talking about the digital equivalent of a wiretap so that you don't know where the person is, but you could be listening in on those communications? Those are very different problems to solve, but knowing where the priority is, where the difficulty lies across different kinds of cases and sort of across the magnitude of cases that are out there would be helpful. But we've never seen the Department of Justice come forward with that kind of specificity, which, to your point earlier, that this debate has been going on a very long time. In the mid-90s, under CALEA, which is the act of Congress that gave law enforcement access to wired telecommunications communication, to be able to wiretap that. In their reports to Congress, they were able to break down exactly how many cases, which kinds of devices, which specific technological challenges they faced in order to say, this is the way that we intend to go forward. But we have not seen that kind of very specific breakdown from the Department of Justice saying, here's exactly how our problem sits with us. Here are the specific kinds of technologies that we see. It's just sort of this inchoate rage frustration that doesn't actually help industry solve the problem. And part of the challenge here is that in the absence of that very specific response, DOJ's request for access to encryption is heard by industry as just nerd harder, solve it for us. And it's like, okay, but what do you want us exactly to solve? I think that there definitely needs to be a more healthy conversation between industry and government about what can be done to address malicious activity on the internet and criminal actors. We're not in a great place on that. And Alison, you and I have written extensively about that challenge, but it's very hard to have that conversation when the Department of Justice's loudest argument is, hey, break this fundamental protection for us.
Michael, I'm interested in your thoughts on that. You know, Mieke's point that the Department of Justice really has not pulled on some of these threads in terms of the main argument that they're making on exceptional access, and really what Congress sort of in its oversight function and questioning the Department of Justice should do in terms of posing some of these questions that Mieke draws out on the arguments that DOJ is making. And I know as somebody that previously served in the White House that worked closely with DOJ, you know, to Matt's point, there are legitimate concerns here. Do you feel like some of these arguments Mieke is making in terms of DOJ's lack of explanation further in terms of really why they need this authority is valid?
So I think one of the biggest challenges here is we keep looking for the technical solution to this problem. And the reality is there is not a technical solution to the problem, right? It's math. And so, you know, it's built into the fabric of our universe because it's math. And so therefore we can't escape from that. And so what we really are talking about here is we actually need policy solutions, right? We need structural solutions to this challenge. And so that means you actually have to start doing some of what Mieke was talking about. So breaking down the problem. Okay, so not all, let's just look at one aspect of this. Not all encryption is equal because not all data is equal. Do we really need exceptional access to communications between OT devices that run SCADA systems? No, probably not. Okay, so we'll set that aside. Are we talking about scale? So do you want to be able, Mieke's question was absolutely right. Are you talking about, do you want access to a device that you already have? Or do you want to be able to reach out and touch any communication anywhere? Okay, well, the risks associated with giving access to a device that you actually have to have physical access to, wow, that's very different than being able to do remote access anywhere on the planet, right? The risk-benefit calculus is very, very different there. In fact, actually, if you have physical access to the device, almost any hacker will tell you, well, I can get into that. You know, if you give me enough time, if you actually give me unfettered access to your device, I mean, really, you know, so you start having to, so what we really need to do is start breaking down a lot of these questions, like scale. What scale are we talking about? What is the type of data that we're talking about? Who holds the key? Is it the government? Is it a third party? Is it a vendor? Because then those key holders are going to become enormous targets. So how are we going to protect them? What is the due process that we want to use? You know, and how much transparency do we want to have around that process so that we can set up a system that people have confidence in, that this system is not being abused? And then how do you set up then you're actually faced with what I would call a political question. And I don't mean that in a pejorative sense. I mean that in the sense of you will be talking about weighing various risks, and the risk to our national security, the risk to economies versus the risk posed by these very real criminal elements. And so there'll be some residual risk that we cannot get rid of, even by a strong policy process and strong technology. And then it becomes a political question writ large for society, and that's squarely in Congress's wheelhouse, that we have to decide what risk we're willing to take to get what gain. And that's really where the question needs to be. And we need to, I believe it is incumbent upon all of us that are involved in this issue to try to clarify our thinking and hone that thinking so that we're posing the right policy questions for our, the policymakers and decision makers so that they can actually make an informed decision on this.
So on that point, Michael, on the policy questions, particularly for folks on Capitol Hill, and I do have some questions coming in, but again, would encourage everyone to post questions now so we can make sure we cover them all. But you all have touched on this thread a little bit about the lack of a tech solution to encryption and the need to really ask these tangible policy questions that Michael and Mieke have raised. And, particularly for folks on Capitol Hill, no one likes being told just blanket, no, don't do this. They always want to be told, okay, well, what can we do to help to really address the legitimate concerns that Matt talked about earlier? So what tangible actions are we talking about here that both law enforcement and Congress can take to identify and bring to justice bad actors that are abusing encryption services that don't provide as much of a threat to national security? So there's a number of pieces of legislation right now up on Capitol Hill that look at the issue of exceptional access and encryption, but are there other pieces of the coin here that Congress can work on to really help law enforcement address its concerns about its ability to bring to justice a broad range of criminals, including malicious cyber actors? And I pose that really to all of you. Maybe Mieke, if you want to start.
Yeah, we've talked about this a lot in our work on the Cyber Enforcement Initiative, right? There are a lot of things that the government can be doing in terms of training up its personnel to understand this. We've seen in a few of these cases, the technological issues made much worse because we didn't have people who understood what was going on. In the San Bernardino case, for example, there might have been a way for Apple to actually help because the phone was owned by the school district there, but there was some confusion about what exactly to do with that device. Better clarity between the companies and law enforcement about exactly what they can provide legally under a variety of methods. Some of their business records and other things are available based on lawful demands by law enforcement. Law enforcement needs to have a better understanding of how to use that information, how to use domain name lookups, how to trace email addresses, things like that. And then there's a lot of work that law enforcement can do with its foreign partners to bring them up to speed. Because if you think things are bad in the US, in many cases internationally, it's far worse. How do we make sure that our foreign partners, when we serve them a warrant saying, hey, we think that these crimes are coming from your jurisdiction, they know how to trace that information and help us bring people to justice. A lot of times we may know who the person is, but we can't get access to them. There are many things that we can do there, but I know Matt has done a lot of work on this in his Going Dark report, and maybe can talk about a few of those things that they came up with.
Yeah, sure, Mieke. And I agree with all of those suggestions. One broad sort of point is, as you guys were talking, I was thinking of the fact that, one of the challenges in this debate is that the sort of prime experience we've had was the Apple San Bernardino litigation, which, was a really, in some ways, a bad way to try to resolve this problem, right? Where you get two sides going head to head, and then you end up now then with sort of that really was a zero-sum game, right? And so you frame the debate in a very sort of win, no one's going to win kind of framing. So Congress, and the folks on this call moving forward, is part of the challenge is bringing those sides together, right, to try to enable this debate, which I think this conversation is part of. But, to your question or your point, Mieke, so yeah, we, as a former prosecutor, I look at this problem a little bit maybe more broadly. I was a prosecutor in the 20 years ago, and it does strike me that today prosecutors in the U.S. attorney's offices around the country and local district attorney's offices have a range of tools available to them that I didn't have. One is just the fact that as much as encryption is expanding and proliferating, there are many companies, perhaps a majority of providers of internet services and communication services that don't encrypt all of their data because it's part of their business model to be able to access that, whether that's for their own functionality or in case, a user loses their password. So there's a lot of information that's not encrypted. So, the education side of this, Mieke, that you point to, helping law enforcement learn how to get easily be able to access that information is really important. The other point that's clear to me is just how much more surveillance there is. I mean, in the sense that there are through the Internet of Things and network sensors today than there was 20 years ago. So there's a lot of information, whether it's images and video and audio, that we see this on the evening news, right? That police have access to that they didn't. So like learning how to exploit that information to solve crimes and not just focusing on the piece of information that might be encrypted, really important. And then you mentioned metadata as well, which is, that's not going to be encrypted because it's necessary to route communications, for example. And that is often very useful in solving crime. So there's a lot of data that's out there that law enforcement can use if they're trained and if they've got that relationship established with companies, because it's a two-way street. It's not just on law enforcement, it's on companies too, to make it available with lawful order and under a legal regime to law enforcement when it's properly requested.
Michael, I'm interested in your thoughts on that last point. I mean, you do a lot of work at your organization with the private sector. And so as Congress is considering the request of law enforcement and debating these issues, are there things that you feel like Congress can do to help to sort of better facilitate this dialogue between the law enforcement community and the private sector on this issue, which, as Matt talked about and you talked about as well, there are legitimate trade-offs and concerns here. So what can Congress do to better help build that relationship between the two sides?
Well, I think one of the prime things is to really try to focus in on what is, again, this is a thing we've been talking about, what is the real problem we're actually trying to solve here, right? And, where is it that we can get 60% of a loaf, and that's still better off than, Matt 20 years ago, because we've still got all this extra data that's, that's sitting out there. And so I think, for example, so if the real problem, right, is at the state and local level, because they don't have access to, the same kinds of, the same kinds of sophisticated tools and techniques that, say, the Bureau has access to. Because, at the end of the day, in a major counterterrorism case or other things, I mean, the Bureau is also going to be able to draw on, expertise from the NSA and from CIA and other places across the government that, the police department in Peoria is not going to have access to, right? And so, some of this is, okay, well, so are we trying to provide assistance, technical assistance to state and local governments? Okay, well, that's one set of problems, and let's talk about how much of the problem that then solves without even dealing with the encryption issue. And again, it's sort of using the power of that convening to be able to try to drill down and get at the specific problems and look for the solution spaces that do exist that make the problem less. And I think that actually then helps to build the kind of trust that you need to actually work towards longer term solutions. And the other thing that I also think about too is that one of the things that we see in cybersecurity, right, is that generally speaking, people are pretty lousy at implementing a lot of security solutions. Since the bad guys take advantage of this all the time. And so the chances that actually implementing encryption and using encryption consistently so that it is actually, in fact, secure all of the time is actually really hard to do. And so, cybersecurity companies can also provide insights into how you can actually make use of the fact that bad guys, like normal citizens, often screw up in how they implement technology and don't patch or don't catch up with the latest thing, and you can exploit that. And to me, those are all spaces that are available to us that we should actually be looking at, and Congress in its role can help use its convening power to help further those kinds of conversations by really drilling down onto some of the specifics.
We also had a question, I think, that dovetails with what all of you are saying in terms of the examples of Pensacola and San Bernardino. And really, if Congress is not going to move forward with legislation on exceptional access, are there areas that they should be focused on right now when it comes to counterterrorism that maybe they're not doing enough legislating on? Are there huge gaps that they need to address through legislation, or their oversight mechanisms that really should be more of the focus than this debate right now in exceptional access? And maybe Matt, I'll turn to you, just given your past background at NCPC, if you have thoughts on that.
That's a great question. And look, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind, and Mieke and I we both worked on this, which was on the surveillance side of the coin, right? When it comes to counterterrorism capabilities, one of the things I cared the most about in the past 5 to 10 years was making sure that FISA, and particularly Section 702 of FISA, remained a robust tool for counterterrorism surveillance purposes, right? So that's really not totally germane here, but if you were to ask me where I think Congress has done actually an extraordinarily good job over the past 15 years or so, it's in reforming FISA with regard to Section 702, and there's still obviously some work to do with renewing some of those provisions of FISA. So you sort of teed me up for that, Allison. But
I was going to say, I know Mieke is going to have a lot of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there's some unfinished business there beyond the scope of this discussion. But I'll go back to Michael's point too. I think, look, Congress has it's just a uniquely positioned to play a convening role in bringing these two sides of this parties together, of this debate together, that federal courts are not well equipped to do, which have to pick winners and losers. So there are, and your last point, Michael, about how hard it is actually to pull off really effective encryption if you're a criminal or a terrorist. There's just a lot of opportunity here to find solutions short of, kind of the most extreme suggestions around technical solutions. Because the reality is too, there's not a silver bullet here. To Michael's point, there's not a silver bullet on the technical side. There's just some trade-offs that we have to make as a country.
Allison, I would just mention for folks who are looking for things like this, like the Earn It Act, I think, even with people's trying to fix it, it still has a lot of challenges to work out. But there are things like Stemmings Bill on digital evidence, which would create a new digital evidence office that sort of address some of the challenges that we've been talking about here, which is like, how do you get state and locals up to speed given the vast challenges that they face, understanding the technology, which is constantly evolving, and understanding how to use those things. But there is a lot of interest from members of Congress. Ted Lieu and others have expressed concern about what gets lost in encryption. But really, we don't want to be in a position of just saying no, but saying, okay, well, what can we do? Because I think that we would all agree that bad actors on the internet, whether or not they're exploiting children or planning terrorist attacks, like, we shouldn't just assume that the internet's going to be a lawless place. We want to make sure that we're doing what we can, because none of us in society have an interest in just letting that continue. We want to make sure that people are held accountable and brought to justice in those things. And there are many ways that we can do that, but we can't do it if there's an adversarial relationship between technology the technology industry that we all rely on, and law enforcement, when we do have a shared goal here.
Yeah, and Mieke, I think, a narrative thread throughout this entire conversation is the need for more capacity and education of law enforcement on cybercrime and digital evidence more broadly. And you bring up the Stemmings Bill that has been introduced in the House. Not that this is an endorsement, but it also has some pretty extensive provisions in terms of supporting grant programs and other training institutes for law enforcement on this issue. So would encourage folks on the call to take a look at that piece of legislation, but also just some of the issues that it touches upon in terms of Congress moving forward on some actions. We have a question in terms of the difference between corporate and private encrypted communications. Don't most corporations or government entities monitor communications, meaning no exceptional access is required?
I mean, yes. I mean, that gets at Matt's point about, like, there's a lot of businesses that actually don't encrypt certain kinds of data because it's fundamental to their business model. Or if they encrypt it while it's in transit, they don't encrypt it while it's at rest because they're actually trying to do things with it. right? For example. And so understanding that is really, really important because, you know, it may be the case that, you know, a part of the data is available. Again, it all depends on the business model and what they're actually using that data for, or whether, or, you know, or what they're not using it for. So I think that is really, so it really varies extensively from company to company and product to product and platform to platform, exactly how the data is structured.
And then we have another question that deals with tech companies' lack of transparency. So the question is about whether or not you believe that tech companies' lack of transparency regarding the data that they collect on users dovetails with the breakdown in communication between law enforcement and tech companies. It's hard to request particular data from tech companies when those companies themselves aren't upfront about what they collect. So this larger question about the role of tech companies here and the data that they're collecting and what potentially that does in terms of the relationship with law enforcement.
Yeah.
Mieke?
Yeah, I was just gonna say on that, like, look, I think that we don't want government to use the vast amount of information that tech companies gather as a fishing expedition to just sort of dragnet everything that they have out there and then to build a, you know, pervasive picture of what we're all doing. Law enforcement is trying to solve specific crimes, specific incidents. So law enforcement should have a specific set of information of what they're looking for. You know, the location of suspected perpetrators at particular times, communications between potential conspirators, things like that, so that I don't know how much of it is about law enforcement doesn't know the vast universe of what companies have, but law enforcement should have a sense of what information they're seeking to be able to solve the crime that they are asking of technology companies. But that said, you know, this is one of those places where Congress, when they did away in the 90s with the Office of Technology Assessment, really did itself a disservice, because you could have an organization that does an assessment of what kinds of information is out there and available for law enforcement, and provide that information back to Congress so that they could make some decisions about what kinds of things are business records and could be asked for with a subpoena, what kinds of things are content and need to be asked for with a warrant. As companies' information on us becomes more pervasive, some of those things paint a much more intimate picture of our lives, and we might want to change, you know, to Matt's point about balance, you might want to change what a prosecutor or investigator has to show before they can ask for that information. But again, it's the investigator who's investigating a specific incident, not just sort of knowing what's out there and pre-identifying criminals. This is not some kind of, like, you know, Minority Report movie where you have people like predicting based on algorithms who's going to commit what. Like, we're not there, and hopefully we'll never be.
Matt, did you have thoughts on that too, this question of a lack of transparency regarding data collection and how that impacts this debate?
I mean, I think, you know, at a high level, the transparency point is a valuable good that we should be pushing. I mean, it goes both ways, right? Companies work to be more transparent with their users and consumers about how data that is shared with those companies is being used, and that, I think, is something I think, you know, generally is a positive trend. And I think similarly, when those companies are transparent about how to access information for law enforcement, like to Miike's point, you know, what is the requirement to get in terms of this available through a subpoena or a search warrant? You know, what sort of information might be available? I totally agree that this isn't about a fishing expedition. It's about targeted requests from law enforcement when they have a specific and well predicated request. But I think the general trend toward more transparency by large technology companies and platforms about how data that it collects is being used is in everyone's interest, whether that's, you know, consumers or the law enforcement community.
Well, I want to thank everyone so much for sending through so many questions. Unfortunately, we're about out of time. So what we will do is we'll send out the brief that Third Way recently wrote on this topic, which will have contact information, and you can feel free to follow up directly as well. But I want to give all three of you the last word. So we have a few minutes left, and you were able to cover a lot of broad issues in this debate, as starting out conversation about sort of the trade-offs here. This isn't an easy debate. There's no easy solution here, but you spoke about some of the things that Congress can focus on that don't go as far as exceptional access and threaten national security. And I think you provided some good examples of where Congress and US policymakers more broadly can go here. But I'll give you each the last word if there's something that you want to impart on the audience before we wrap up. I'll start with you, Michael.
Sure, well, thanks, Allison. I would say just don't fall for magical thinking, because it's not there. And so we are not going to solve this problem. We are going to find a way to manage this issue and balance between the security trade-offs that we have. And the solution may involve some technological pieces, or the approach that we use may involve some technological pieces, but it is going to be more about process and how we set up the policies and surrounding architecture than it really is the technology. And at the end of the day, it is probably going to leave everybody feeling a little bit uncomfortable because it is that hard of an issue.
Mieke?
Yeah, I would just say for policymakers to make sure you're disaggregating the emotion and intensity you feel about the problem, whether that's child pornography or terrorism, which is something that we all want to solve, from the solution. And really being very specific about how. How is this a problem? How would the solution work? I think there's a tendency in policymaking to get carried away by the size of the problem. And really, we all can agree on that. But being much more specific about the solution will actually yield something that's constructive as opposed to a stalemate.
And Matt, you got the last word.
I agree with both Michael and Mieke on those points. I would say, well, one, I applaud this group for taking this issue on, this group meaning the members of Congress and their staffs. And this is the time, I think, to do this as compared to after a significant attack or a significant incident that will create its own sort of imperatives. I think that it's better to try to solve really hard issues like this now. And I would also just secondly say, there are those who say Congress is, not really in a position to do this because things are so divided. But I really commend the members of Congress and their staffs who are digging into this issue. And I'm hopeful at this point.
Great. Well, with that, again, I want to thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. And again, we will follow up through email, providing more information, and please feel free to reach out to Third Way at any time with additional questions. Thank you all very much and have a great afternoon.